Our next speaker then is Chien from Seattle. Elevated baseline serum lysyl oxidase 2 levels are associated with higher risk for IPF. Dr. Chien.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to represent the team that's working on this compound, or this antibody actually, for IPF. So LOXL2 is actually a lysyl oxidase like 2, and it's an enzyme that belongs to a family of 5 different LOXL enzymes. In IPF, LOXL2 is a direct driver of disease-associated fibrogenesis, and it promotes cross-linking of fibrillar collagen 1, which is a major component of desmoplastic stroma, and it also plays a very crucial role in matrix remodeling, fibrogenesis, and formation of pathologic stroma. Interestingly, LOXL2 is not involved in normal wound healing. Now, we're interested in this target because we have an antibody called GS6624, and in the mouse, it's AB0023, which is specific, non-competitive allosteric inhibitor of LOXL2. Now, if you were to stain lung biopsies from IPF patients, what you'll find is that LOXL2 expression is only limited to the sites of active fibrogenesis. And in fact, there's really very little expression of LOXL2 in normal lung. I'll go through some of our preclinical data from just as background, but the bottom line is that LOXL2 is important in the recruitment, activation, and maintenance of fibroblasts at these sites of fibrogenesis, where the fibroblasts are responsible for laying down the matrix and also secreting additional growth factors, which then feeds into this vicious cycle. The antibody is designed so that it blocks LOXL2 and breaks this vicious cycle, and as you'll see in the animal models, it actually can reverse fibrosis. In a therapeutic model of lung injury, the bleomycin model, what we found was that after the lung has been damaged and after the antibody has been administered, as expressed by alpha SMA levels, there's significant reduction in terms of the extent of fibrosis. I'm not going to go through all the other findings in these preclinical studies, but I'll just summarize them here. In the same model, what we found was that this antibody protects against lung damage, as demonstrated by a significant reduction in the Ashcroft score, reverses fibrosis with a significant reduction in cross-linked collagen. It also reduces LOXL2 levels, that's measured in the lung, significantly inhibits multiple growth factors, as well as serum and BAL fluid markers reflecting the mechanism of action. Now, thinking about LOXL2 as a biomarker is a natural extension of this preclinical work. An informative biomarker here could potentially be very helpful in overcoming some of the challenges that we face in clinical trials for IPF. For instance, for our antibody, this could serve as a pharmacodynamic assay. This biomarker may also have prognostic value, which could be potentially useful in balancing and enriching our clinical trials for subjects with poor IPF outcomes. It may ultimately have predictive value, where we can use this antibody to identify patients who may be more likely to respond to GS6624. And driven by this, we designed a novel sandwich immunoassay that is designed to detect LOXL2 antibodies within the serum. And using this assay, we evaluated the hypothesis whether serum LOXL2 levels are reflective of IPF disease activity. As some of you might recollect or actually taken part in is the Artemis IPF phase 3 study. One of the silver linings of that study was that select subjects in the United States actually had serum samples collected at baseline. The Artemis IPF study used a composite primary endpoint of IPF disease progression, and this composed of all-cause mortality, adjudicated respiratory hospitalizations, or a categorical decrease in lung function that consists of both FVC and DLCO. We measured LOXL2 in these serum samples, and then we used something called a classification and regression tree, or CART analysis, to select the LOXL2 threshold that dichotomized the LOXL2 levels for further analysis and easier interpretation. First thing we did was compare the characteristics of the subjects with and without serum samples at baseline. And as demonstrated here, where on the left you have multiple baseline measures of IPF severity, there's really no significant difference between the subjects with and without serum. Here I provide a description of what the LOXL2 levels look like in this population of 67 subjects. The median was 304 picograms per mil. The interquartile range was 144 and 738. The range went from 18 all the way up to 5,389. And then the CART analysis identified 800 as a suggested threshold for further analysis. Now, the very interesting aspect of this analysis was that there was absolutely no significant correlation between baseline LOXL2 levels and all the other measures of IPF severity. So, for instance, FVC, DLCO, 6-minute walk distance, pulmonary artery pressure, CPI index, SGRQ, and also the TDI. These are correlation coefficients that you see in these boxes. However, despite the lack of correlation, what we found was that high LOXL2 levels, as demonstrated by greater than 800 picograms per mil, is associated with significantly more disease progression events. And this is demonstrated by these cumulative incidence curves. In the upper left, you'll see the cumulative incidence curve for disease progression. And this is clearly statistically significant. Because this is a composite endpoint, we also look at the components separately. And as you can see, this observation is largely driven by lung function decline events and respiratory hospitalization events, both of which are also statistically significant. Death, however, was not statistically significant, although there appears to be a trend towards an increased number of deaths among the subjects with high LOXL2. Looking at this with a Cox proportional hazard model, where we were able to adjust for not only baseline measures of disease severity, but also adjust for the treatment assignment in this study, what we found was that high LOXL2 was associated with a 5.4-fold increase in disease progression. And again, this was largely driven by lung function respiratory hospitalization events, 7.6-fold increase in lung function decline events, 5.3-fold increase in respiratory hospitalization events. Again, all-cause mortality was not statistically significant, but there was a 2-fold increase in terms of a trend towards increased risk. Now, what does this mean? Just revisiting our original hypothesis, serum LOXL2 levels are reflective of IPF disease activity, not severity. Now, this is obviously not data. This is a figure that reflects the different potential pathways that a patient might take in their clinical course of IPF. And this is, I think, actually shown earlier this morning. What I've put on here are these red stars, or various colored red stars, white being low LOXL2, red being high LOXL2, and moderate being, or pink being moderate LOXL2. What we suspect is that LOXL2 levels probably fluctuate during the clinical course of an IPF patient's disease. During periods of rapid progression, or just before those periods, we might suspect that LOXL2 levels might be high in the serum. And during periods where the disease is quiescent, you might expect that the LOXL2 levels might be low. Therefore, serum LOXL2 levels might represent a prognostic marker for potentially poor IPF outcomes, and hopefully a predictive biomarker for response to our antibody. Now, having said that, I think, and the fact that we're pretty excited about this, there are many limitations to this analysis that we should definitely recognize. First, this population is not representative of a typical IPF population. As you might recall, Artemis IPF enrolled a mild to moderate IPF population that had less than 5% honeycombing, which is highly unusual in terms of IPF patients. We also had a very small sample size. This sample size leads to very large confidence intervals in our point estimates, and therefore there's much refinement to be done in terms of that analysis. We also had a very low event rate, which means that some of these findings may not be statistically significant in a larger population. Finally, we were unable to completely control for the confounding effects of ambrisentan, and as you might recall, ambrisentan treatment was associated actually with poorer outcomes in the Artemis IPF study. These findings will clearly require additional external validation with large independent cohorts of IPF patients that span the entire spectrum of disease severity. So in conclusion, we believe that baseline serum LOXL2 levels are associated with significant higher risk for poor IPF outcomes based on this analysis. Serum LOXL2 levels are likely to be reflective of IPF disease activity and not severity, and that's demonstrated by the lack of correlation with other markers of disease severity. Excitingly, this represents the first time where there's a link between a mechanism of action, a biomarker, and a clinically meaningful outcome in IPF. And we hope that serum LOXL2 levels may have a prognostic as well as a potential predictive value for clinical trials in IPF. Thank you.
Oh, we're doing well time-wise. Let me ask you the first question.
Yep.
Early in your slide series, you had a histologic, immunohistologic stain of the LOXL. I think that's what it was, right, in the fibrotic foci. And I wasn't sure if you were surprised with the pattern or not, because the cells you had labeled, you called them epithelial cells, but those cells that come out on the surface of those are either mesenchymal cells or myofibroblasts or EM cells going through EMT. So if that were true, if that is true, are you surprised at the pattern you saw or not?
I think because of the activity of LOXL2, we really did expect to see it at the foci. We probably did not expect to see it as focused as we saw it. One, for instance, would have expected at least some expression at the epithelial sites, but clearly it was very directed towards the fibroblasts.
Right, so it may be because those are mesenchymal cells, that's why you saw
Yes.
them. Is that right? Okay.
Perhaps.
Jack.
Explain a little bit then about what you think the function of LOXL2 is doing in this particular situation. Is it a cross-linking activity, or is it a chemotactic activity, or what's your
I think it's a
feelings?
combination of both. It attracts fibroblasts, it actually activates them, but also it's involved in the cross-linking of the collagen 1.
Both roles playing,
Right.
giving rise to the association between the severity.
Right. Or the activity, actually. The activity of the fibroblastic foci.
Thanks, Jason. Can I ask you two questions? One,
Sure.
Can you just explain why, I know that the groups weren't different, but why did you have so few patients with blood? And then the second is, can you explain how you broke people at 800? Because I'm always worried about dichotomizing variables that really are continuous unless there's a good rationale for it.
So let me address the first question first. So I actually was not with Gilead when that study was designed, and I can just say that I believe the blood decision to collect blood samples was actually made midway through the study, and because of that, the implementation was not complete across all the sites, and as you know, the study also ended early. So that was all we actually ended up with at the end of the study. Your second question is actually an absolute critical one in the development of biomarkers. So, and there are multiple components to that question. The first part is, how do we decide 800? Well, we use an objective approach, the card analysis approach, where it's basically a computer algorithm that tries to select an optimal threshold for dichotomization of the data based upon the outcome that you want the software to look at. In this case, was PFS. Now, having said that, I highly doubt that 800 is going to hold from here on out. So, for instance, we've looked at other populations and done the same card analysis, and there are definitely shifts in terms of that threshold. The second thing is that this assay is actually a research-grade assay. So we have not completely validated it, and certainly for a clinical trial, we'd have to develop a validated assay that will have a pre-specified threshold that we will have to establish before we actually go in and analyze the data. So there's definitely much work to be done in terms of this assay. We selected 800 simply to make it easier to interpret the results, so to speak, but clearly this is a range of LOXL2 values that have to be looked at in a much larger population.
Is that a question from a competing company, or?
Yeah, well, from someone who shares your pain. I'm Joe Aaron from Genentech, and I think, at least in talking to people here, and you would, if you're in academics, you would have no reason to worry about these issues that you're talking about, but the regulatory aspects of developing and prospectively validating a biomarker are significant if you're trying to do it along with the clinical development program. So I feel your pain. We can have a drink about it later.
You guys know all about it.
But I wanted to follow up Hal's question. So you said the median value for your LOXL2 is about 300 picograms per mil, and your cutoff was 800, which I believe was somewhere north of the top of the interquartile range. So could you just speak to, given that the N of the study was 67, you're talking about maybe somewhere between 15 and 20 patients, and how many events actually occurred in those patients in terms of disease progression?
You can actually see the event rates. If I could go back to, I showed you the event rates in that table. So the event rates are here. So it turns out that high LOXL2 represent about the top third. And as you rightly pointed out,
less than the top quarter, right?
I'm sorry, top quarter, right? In this population, it's top quarter. We've looked at another population that came out at about, actually, top third to median. But bottom line is that you're absolutely right. This is a tiny, tiny population, and to make any kind of definitive remarks on 67, based on data from 67 subjects, would be almost ridiculous. I mean, this is exciting. I think this is interesting, but clearly needs a lot of validation work.
Like I said, I feel your pain.
Yeah.
Okay, anything further? Thanks, Jason.